King turned the United States firmly against Japan. But US President Franklin Roosevelt believed that the US was more likely to get embroiled in war in Europe than the Far East. Thus, while he authorized cash payments to the Chinese to fund their war efforts against the Japanese, and even allowed American pilots to fight for the Chinese Air Force as part of the famous Flying Tigers unit, he remained more focused on preparing to confront Hitler. This played into Japan's hands as they continued their expansion into China and Southeast Asia. But under continuing pressure from his military commanders, Roosevelt did authorize increasingly tougher restrictions on trade with Japan in an effort to punish them for their actions in China beginning in 1938. The Japanese themselves also viewed war with America as unlikely, and were more concerned with another conflict breaking out with the Soviet Union north of their Manchurian conquests. But the American embargoes did hurt them and cause alarm in the Japanese leadership. Nevertheless, in September 1940, a week before Japan joined the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, Japanese troops entered French Indochina, now Vietnam, escalating what the US and UK saw as a growing crisis in Asia. At first, the Japanese only used Indochina as a base for troops in the event of a war with the Soviet Union, but when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Japan occupied the rest of the country and would continue to do so until 1945. After Japanese troops entered French Indochina, the US placed their toughest sanctions yet on Japan by embargoing vital scrap metal exports and barring Japanese ships from using the Panama Canal. Tensions between both sides rose throughout 1941, leading to a series of negotiations to bring about a peaceful solution. But the Japanese military, especially the Navy, viewed war with the US as inevitable. The Japanese had by that time plans to invade British, Dutch and French possessions deeper into southern Asia, as part of its plans under its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere concept, such as Brunei and the Dutch East Indies. But this expansion would leave them vulnerable to attack from the US, based in the Philippines, should they decide to interfere. Therefore, they began to draw up plans for a decisive attack on the US Navy, in an effort to destroy it before it could mobilize. As early as 1940, the Japanese began theorizing plans for an attack on Hawaii and the Philippines. By April 1941, the Japanese began training for an attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, in what they had dubbed Operation Z, which was the brainchild of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The pilots trained to attack ships in Pearl Harbor using air-launched torpedoes, but the problem was that these weapons tended to dive deeper than the shallow waters of the harbour allowed. The Japanese came up with a cunning solution: wooden fins that forced the torpedo to rise up immediately after hitting the water. On November 26, 1941, the Japanese fleet set sail for Hawaii under strict radio silence. At the time, both the US and Washington were still negotiating, but Roosevelt's government had by then begun demanding Japan withdrew from China altogether, something totally unthinkable to the Japanese leadership. The fleet comprised of 6 aircraft carriers with 359 fighters and bombers, making it the most powerful naval aviation force in history at that time. On December the 1st, Yamamoto was informed that war with the Dutch, US and UK had been authorized by the Japanese leadership. But should it appear that both sides were about to reach an amicable solution prior to December the 7th, then he should authorize to pull the fleet back and cancel the attack. Endowed with intelligent photographs of Pearl Harbor taken by a Japanese spy aboard a sightseeing aircraft, Yamamoto made his final preparations on December the 6th, and with no sign of a peaceful solution, the next morning the aircraft took off from their carriers. The air attack was preceded by a group of Japanese midget submarines that attempted to sneak into the harbour, but one of them was attacked and sunk by the destroyer, USS Ward, which fired the first American shots of the Pacific theatre of World War II. This should have alerted the Americans to an attack, but the information did not reach the US Admiralty in time. Meanwhile, an American radar station spotted the formation of Japanese aircraft, but was told that it was a flight of B-17s arriving from mainland USA, and so no action was taken. At Pearl Harbor, the sailors were waking up and preparing for a routine Sunday with naval bands playing songs, while the skies began to fill with aircraft. The Americans were taken completely by surprise, and the bands were still playing as the first bombs and torpedoes struck the ships. During the course of the attack, the Japanese damaged or sank 8 American battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and a mine layer. A number of nearby US Army airfields were also hit in air raids. The aircraft based there had been bunched together on the ground to make it easier to guard them against possible sabotage, but all this did was increase the damage caused by the bombs as they landed amongst them. In all, the US lost 2,403 service personnel in the course of the attack, while over 1,000 more were seriously wounded. The damage could have been greater had Yamamoto not decided to cancel a follow-up attack, because they had lost the element of surprise. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines that attempted to participate in the attack. All in all, 64 Japanese were killed, while one Japanese Navy officer, Kazuo Sakamaki, was captured alive after his submarine was grounded, becoming the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by the Americans. Crucially, however, and almost purely by chance, the US Navy's aircraft carriers were not present at the harbour, and thus survived unscathed. The next day, President Roosevelt met with the US Congress to ask them to vote on declaring war on Japan. The vote was almost unanimously in favour of war, save for one objection by Representative Janet Rankin of Montana. She told Congress, "As a woman, I cannot go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." In his speech, Roosevelt described December the 7th as a date which would live in infamy. Less than 4 days after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Adolf Hitler, acting on his own authority, and without consulting his staff, ordered his government to declare war on the US in support of Japan, and in response to what he viewed as the USA violating its neutrality by supporting Britain. For the United States of America, the Second World War had begun. Admiral Yamamoto predicted that after the opening of hostilities with the USA, Japan would have 6 months with which to decisively defeat the US in the Pacific, to such an extent that Washington would have to sue for peace, which would effectively surrender the Pacific and Asia to Tokyo. Few in Japan truly believed that an invasion of the US mainland was a possibility, given how overstretched Japan was already with its war, which was primarily aimed at British and Dutch Empire territories, with the grand prize being Australia itself. The reason he gave 6 months was because that was how long he predicted it would take for the mighty US industrial complex to fully gear up for war, after which Japan could not hope to match American war production. The Japanese therefore wasted little time and began their own form of blitzkrieg in the east. Within 24 hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops had attacked British forces in Malaya and Hong Kong, and American forces on the Philippines. On December the 10th, 2 British battlecruisers, HMS Prince of Wales,